Yeah, welcome back to our great conference package, Webinare IPC Voice Conference. We are heading to our next talk, and for this, I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker to you. Welcome, Juan Pablo Ramirez.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
very much for introducing.
Yeah, Juan, you are gonna have the next talk. You are working as a web developer at WebRider, and especially you have a passion for test-driven development, and this is exactly what we are gonna have gonna talk right now. CakePHP test fixture factories. I think you can explain it better than me. So with this, yeah, I can wish you all the best for this talk. Have fun, and yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for introducing. I'll share my screen. So I hope you can see my screen now. Just give a shout if you can't. Thank you very much for inviting to the conference. I'm really glad to take take part of it. I'm going to present you today the CakePHP Fixture Factories and a test DB cleaner. I'll get into details in a second about all that. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself and Nicolas Masson, a former colleague and very close friend of mine in between. I'm a developer at WebRider.be. Nicolas is a full-stack developer at bProjects, a company based in Berlin. And together we have a few open source projects that we gather under the Vierge Noire group. Vierge Noire is a group of developers that aim at promoting test-driven development. So that's why we call ourselves test-driven developers. The reality is something in between. Of course, test-driven development is not that simple. Can't always apply. So I'll present here two issues. I will address issues encountered when writing tests interacting with the database. I will address in particular the test fixtures, that is the population of the database before tests get run in the so-called arrange phase of the tests. And in a second part, I will propose some freshly made work on how to clean up the test database before each test gets run, which is a fundamental aspect of tests when interacting with the test database. So I'll first give a small speech on tests very quickly. I'll explain shortly what the CakePHP native ORM can do and how it enabled us to develop a solution to create test fixtures, the so-called CakePHP Fixture Factories, which are now integrated in the CakePHP documentation. And at last, I'll explain the trigger-based database cleaner, which is a tool we developed in order to come up with the feature factories. And since we observed that it was actually framework agnostic, more or less, because it only relied on SQL commands, we decided to extract it and potentially propose it for all frameworks. All right, so quick speech about tests. So we're at the same page. Most of you will know all of that, but what tests should be? Tests should meet the following criteria. They should be intelligible, to be readable. Ideally, you should be able to read them like prose. They should be easy to write and to maintain. You don't want to spend lots of time maintaining your tests. And the excuse of no time for writing tests should not be legitimate. And they should run fast. To that aim, I'll come back into detail, but avoid interaction with the database. Do not load unnecessary fixtures. I'll get into details. Why do we test? Tests help you to write clean code. If you struggle with your tests, it could be due to the complexity of the code you are testing. If your tests can be read and understood, they document your source code. Whenever your code is refactored, whenever features are added or external packages get updated, the tests ensure that your code maintains its integrity. And eventually, as you gain experience in test-driven development, you will find that tests significantly reduce the amount of time spent on code development and, of course, on code maintenance. So tests will save you time and effort. So it's not only about the code integrity, which is often emphasized, it's also about documenting your code and about making sure that your code is clean. How do tests look like? So most of them will follow the famous AAA pattern. So you will first arrange your test. That means preparing the scenario of your test. This is where the test fixtures, for example, are created. This is the part of the fixtures. You will act, which is simply calling the method that is under test. And then you will assert that the result of the method meets your expectations. Test-driven development means that you write arrange and assert before act. So in this presentation, I'll be talking about creating the test fixtures, and I'll take an example with where associations are involved. I'll take the example of user permissions, which is a user that most of you probably had to tackle at some point. We have a table of users, and users belong to many groups. You want to group your users, and each user group has several permissions. So these are belongs to many relationships. So we end up with 5 tables, and therefore, every time we write a test where we'll have a user with a given permission, we'll have to create 5 test fixtures. We'll have to create a user group, and a given permission, possibly more permissions, and then you have the pivot table. So back to the previous example, if I want to test permission foo, I will create a user group permission foo, and the pivot tables. I'll check permission foo for that given user, and I expect that user to have permission foo. All right, that's it for explaining a bit how I see tests, how we see tests at Vierge Noire. And I'll now go to the second part where I explain a bit how the CakePHP ORM works. This is one of the most documented part of the framework. So dig into the documentation if you're interested. I'll just quickly show how associations are built in CakePHP, because this will be relevant when explaining the CakePHP Fixture Factories, because they'll work exactly the same. All right, so here is an example of a users table, really minimalistic with only the part that interests us. You have a users table that relates to the table users, and we declare here the belongs to many users groups relationship. CakePHP follows conventions. You can change the conventions if you want, but if you follow them, you have very little to declare. So if you've called your tables and your fields according to the convention, this is the only thing you'll have to declare to tell CakePHP that there is a belongs to many relationship between the table users and the tables users underscore groups. And this is where once you declare your relationship, this will help you, I'll show in a minute, how to build your queries. We'll do the same for the users group table. It belongs to many users on one side, belongs to many permissions on the other side. And yeah, eventually the same with permissions table that belongs to many users groups. Once this is defined, you can build your query pretty simple. If you want to retrieve all the users, you can join permissions by using the method contain. The users groups dot permissions tells the query builder that you want the users and also the joined permissions. You can also, for example, filter users by permission using the matching method. Don't want to get too much into detail. important is that you see that association dot noted convention notation. It's here. And eventually, this would be the way we would build our has permission method that is going to be under test in our presentation, in my presentation. What you do is write an inner join with. So I've written two solutions. The first one is with database access. You provide a user ID. We build a query where we do an inner join with on permissions, and we'll filter the users according to the permissions. And if something is found, if the count is bigger than 0, we return true. If not, false. And there's a second approach, and I'll explain during the presentation later why this is an important aspect. You can also write your method without database access. If you provide to that method has permission, instead of an ID, you provided an object, a user, so-called entities in CakePHP. You provided a user that already contains the association. For example, after a user has logged in, you might query in, save in the session the user, and save also all its permissions. And in that case, you don't need to do that extra query. The user is known, and you can write your method differently by simply looking the hash extract. This is a CakePHP helper, but it's simply an array filter by looking into the user if it has that permission. This is not interacting with the database, so it's very fast, much faster than the first solution. It will be faster in your tests. It will be also faster in your code. All right, so this is it for introducing a bit how CakePHP works with associations. You're probably finding similarities with Doctrine or Eloquent. Yeah. So back to our example, we have our 3 tables, and when we're going to create when we're going to start a test where we're going to test the permissions of the users, we have to create permissions and the pivot table, users groups, pivot table, and users. It's a lot of work. And if on top of that, we want to test 4 different permissions, or at one permission, but with users with different permissions, it gets even larger to test. You have even more features to create. For example, if we have a user that belongs to the group admins, he might not have the permission foo, but being an admin, he will be allowed to access foo. The same with gurus. With foo, of course, and if a user has association bar, you want to test that he doesn't have the permission foo. So there, in the field of test fixtures, 2 approaches. One is, so to say, static. Well, you're going to create something like an SQL dump. It could be real SQL. It could be configuration files, so-called test fixtures that are loaded before the tests. Generally, the approach assumes that you build a large set of data that you're going to load before each test. And if you have several tests, test 1, 2, 3, they all share the fixtures, the test fixtures of the other tests. This is an inconvenience. First, you have to load the dump before each test. Then you have to identify in test 1 which was the user that was relevant to your test and which one is not relevant to your test. So you have to dig, once the test is started, into your big dump to fetch what you need for that test. So I'd say there only a set of that approach is that it's easy to create. You just fill in your dump with whatever you need, but it's going to get even bigger. It's horrible to maintain if the schema of your database gets modified. You're going to load a lot of fixtures because you're loading the fixture for all the tests before each test. So literally, if we have 4 tests here, 5 tables, since we have 4 tests, we're going to load the fixtures. We're going to load 80 fixtures in total. I've put it in orange because you'll see there are methods to go very fast. You won't necessarily have an impact on performance using transactions. Still, it's horrible to maintain, and you don't have test independency. The second approach, which you will find in the most known PHP frameworks, are the dynamic fixtures or the factories. So you're going to create before each test one user group, one permission, and the pivot tables. Within the test, it's not as easy to create depending on which tool you have. In CakePHP, it's horrible. For example, I mean, creating one fixture is all right. Creating the fixture and all its associations, this gets really complicated. It's easy to maintain, again, depending on which tool you have, but you'll see that with the CakePHP Fixture Factories, it's very easy to maintain. And the number of fixtures loaded is minimal. You load what you need. You create the fixtures that you need for one given test. All right, so I think now this is the big introduction to the problem. You've seen how CakePHP works. You've seen that dynamic or factories are necessary if we want to have an efficient approach to test fixtures. Now I'm going to present the solution we came up, the CakePHP test fixture factories. And I'll show you what a factory looks like. So this is CakePHP code. We have in our app test namespace a factory layer. And here you can see the user factory. So there are two abstract methods that you have to provide, which is on which table that factory is writing, in that case users, and a default template. And the default template is very interesting and useful for two reasons. First, you would probably have some some required fields in your database. For example, the username, you can't leave it empty. The email, say, you can't leave it empty. So this provides default data generated by Faker that will be always set and randomized. So you can override them later in your test, but at least this is set. And on top of that, I've added this with permission line 15. You can tell also the factory, populate me that data, but also apply this method. So for example, with permission, if with permission is a method that creates a random permission, because users should have a permission per default, this is how your business model works, you call the with permission in the set default template method, and you've already carved your fixtures before you have written a single line of code whenever you instantiate a new test fixture. And this is how you create the fixtures. If you want to create a user, you'll just call the user factory make and get an entity. You can create 4 of them. You can persist them in the database. So I'll show that it's very important to distinguish between get entity and persist. Many times you don't want to persist, as I've explained a bit before. You can set override, for example, the username. You can create 2 users. One with the username foo, the other one with the username bar. You can dig in the documentation of the package. There's much more we can do with the factories. And on top of it, for me, the most useful feature is the building of associations. So now you can remember that dot notation we've seen before, which is used in the executable code. You will use them also in the factories. In that case, I've created 3 users that all have the permission foo. I can create also 1 user with permission foo and permission bar. And as I've mentioned already before, factories are classes. They are there for you to put your business model. So if the with permission is something you're going to set regularly, write a method, which will be with user groups.permissions. And you're free to use it. And with the auto-completions, you'll see what you or other users have already created. Take advantage of it. Yes, So I think this is, yeah, that's it for the fixtures. This is how to use them when you write a unit test. When you arrange, you create your user with permission foo. You check that that user, well, you assert act if that user has permission foo, and we expect true in that case. So you see your test is easy to read, it's compact. You don't have to look in a SQL dump or wherever which user had which permission. You see exactly, you see what you get. You get what you see. Yeah, easy to read, easy to maintain, and it runs fast because in our case we haven't persisted the user. We've taken the second option, and this test runs extremely fast. We can run hundreds of tests like this in a second. I'll show some performance after that. Yeah, unit tests. Still, if you want to test several scenarios, an user with permission admin, guru, foo, bar, you can use the very useful data provider PHP unit method annotation tool. And this is going to feed your test with A, the permission, and second, what you expect. So again, on the fly, you create your user with a given permission, check if it has permission foo, and assert that you got what you expected. And a last word on how to write tests. This is an example of behavioral tests, for example, with bhat. If you look at such a behavioral test, you will see everywhere factories. Given I create a user with ID 504, that's a factory. Given a call to a factory, given I log it with permission users, you create that with your factory. And the advantage of the CakePHP factories is that they enable you to write behavioral tests also very efficiently. I won't go much into detail, but yeah, it's a big helper. So I'll sum up the CakePHP Fixture Factories. The highlights, I'd say, is that they provide a default template, making your factories and your tests easy to maintain. If you have a new required field, add it into the template, and you're done. The association builder, this is a powerful tool. You can persist, you don't have to. And also a last point is that the factories will generate random IDs when you persist. So you won't start with ID 1. And this, we have observed that starting always with ID 1 was a source of potential issues in tests. Because, well, if you work with random IDs, you minimize the fact that you've misinterpreted your, miswritten your test. Persist costs. So this is a graphic from a study I made on performance. The x-axis is the number of tests we run. The y-axis is the time in second to perform the whole test suite. In red, which in the lowest curve, in red, the fixtures are generated by the factories and not persisted. So you'll see that the bigger your app, the more tests you have, this will have no impact on the performance of your test suite if you don't persist. In the light blue, this is when you persist, but using dynamic fixtures, using the factory, for example. So indeed, the length, the time the tests take to run increases, but rather slowly. And the upper curve is when the static legacy approach from CakePHP, but which is also shared by other frameworks, you load for each test what every test needs. And you can see that it's the low is square, the more tests you have, and the slower will be the slope, the higher will be the slope of the speed of your tests. So yes, the factories get rid of the upper curve. There's no static fixtures anymore. You can choose between the blue or the red, depending on the demand of your test. If you're doing some integration tests, you definitely have to integrate the database into your tests. But pure unit tests should actually avoid interacting with the database, and the factories give you the possibility to avoid that interaction. All right, so that's it. First, concerning the CakePHP Fixture Factories. It gave you maybe a small insight on the CakePHP framework. It's a very fast framework. When you can develop really fast with it, you'll see that with the fixtures, you can write tests also really fast now. And I'm going to shift to the next topic, which is of course very related. It is the topic of database cleaning. So we have created our fixtures. A test starts, we create our fixtures, the database is populated. And when we're done with all that, the next test will start on the same database, and the database is not clean. So we need a mechanism to clean the test database before each test is run, so we are sure that we start on a brand new database, that the indexes also get the increments, the auto increments get also restarted. So in that part, I'll compare the approach of several large frameworks. I haven't digged into all of them, but I'll just consider what I've seen in Laravel, Symfony, and others, and compare our approach, which is radically different. I'll explain. So in the best case, you will clean your database with transactions. This is the fastest way to do. So what happens in Laravel or in Symfony, the test suite starts, you start your tests. What they do is immediately truncate all tables. The first thing to do, if you are, they all have, both frameworks have their own approach. I won't get very much into details, but roughly this is what's happening. They truncate all tables to make sure we start with something really clean. Then either you will load a test dump. On the left side here is the static approach in red. Let's not do it. Or you take the dynamic approach, which requires that you run migrations. You've truncated all your tables, so you have to run the migrations on your test database. This will take some time. I did some experiment with huge databases, 200, 500, 1,000 tables, and running the migrations takes tens of seconds, 10, 20, takes some time. This is the phase I call the warm-up. This is what is run before your test suite, regardless of how many tests you run, if you run one or your whole tests. So after that, the test starts and an SQL transaction is initiated, the tests run, and when the test is done, the transaction is rolled back. So we know that we're back to the clean database state before the test started. The SQL transaction is a very good approach, and I'm really saying this approach with transaction is the best I've seen, the fastest also. I'm just mentioning the little issues that could happen. First, in Symfony at least, if you're using transactions in your tests, you might have a conflict with that transaction. And yeah, for me, a major drawback of that approach is that you run the migrations prior to the test suite start. This is the so-called warm-up. And if you're doing test-driven development, you're going to run maybe your tests for the method you're testing every 5 minutes. This is going to be 12 times per hour. So you have lost 2 minutes in your hour in that warm-up. Not saying it's the end of the world, but it's worth mentioning and knowing. The approach we came up with at Vierge Noire is to use triggers. So the migrations get run, but you see we never drop tables. we truncate them and we don't drop them. So once you run your migrations in the morning, as long as you don't switch to other branches which have different migrations, which is going to run anyway very fast, if you remain on your branch and your schema doesn't change, running the migrations takes no time because they are already run. Then what we do is create a table. It's not called like this in the package, but let's call it the dirty tables collector. It's a very small table that has one field that are the table name. And we create triggers for each tables. I'll put an example for the users table. Every time that anything is going to be inserted in the users table, we'll insert in the dirty table collector the name of that table, in that case users. So anytime an insert happens on users, we say to the dirty table, users is dirty. And if the user was already marked as dirty by the dirty table collector, we'll just ignore it. But this way, we are able to know at the end of the test which tables had an insert. It happens on the MySQL on the SQL server. So if you're using MySQL, it happens on the MySQL container. So it's really fast. There are no queries on and off. And before the test run, we'll simply run a procedure, which is the fastest way you can go. Again, it all happens on the SQL side that says we're looking to the dirty table collector. Which tables are dirty? Truncate these. So we save time if you have thousands or say hundreds of tables and only 2 are dirty. There's no need to truncate everything. You just truncate the 2 tables that are dirty. You run your tests. And my favorite approach there, apart from the fact that the warm-up is very fast, there's literally no warm-up, we don't truncate the tables. And I don't like the fact to truncate tables. I think it's a waste of time. It's something you don't do in real life. You don't do that in your productive code. You don't do that live. So if we can avoid that in our tests, why not? Yeah. The clock saying it's running fast, and also saying that I'm close to the end of my presentation. I'll get to the, oh no, sorry, there was another slide there. Summing up with the database cleaning, this approach is only one different solution. I'm not saying it's better than what other frameworks do. You'll find it on that URL. It's fast because we have literally no warm-up. It is MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server, SQLite compatible right now. And of course, it's open to extension. We work with interfaces, so if you ever want to improve the package, feel free. It's, so to say, for PHP framework agnostic, because again, there we work with interfaces, so the only thing we know is a connection to run our SQL commands, and an access to the configuration to know on which database should this cleanup take place. It's open to contribution. I'm working currently on the Symfony interface. Feel free to contribute. Yeah, that's it. Feel free to join the project. What we want is something that is really framework agnostic, so all the efforts of the community can be put on having the SQL commands be as performant as possible and get a kind of universal solution. The project is very new, it's just started. Yeah, so there's a lot of room for improvement, but as I said, I have tests written for CakePHP and Laravel, and it works, it's very really efficient. Yeah, and now I'm at the conclusion of the talk. CakePHP used to say, build fast and grow solid. I'd say that with the Fixture Factories, you can now grow solid because it makes the writing of tests rather easy, and test is a must, I'd say, in order to grow something solid. You are free, feel free to join us to improve the test database cleaner. It's a large project, and as much framework it can support, the better it will be for the community. And yeah, just to mention again, credits to myself and Nicolas Masson. You'll see our website viergenoir.github.io. And again, if you want to communicate with us, if you want some support, some technical support, if you want to join, share ideas on that topic, you're very more than welcome. And this said, I'm done with the presentation itself, and I'll have a look at the questions.
So first of all, thank you very much, Juan, for these great insights. Very interesting project indeed. And as you said, now we have time for questions. And for this, you can use the chat in Swapcard. Of course, there's also a question tab where we are posted somewhere. We will find it. Right now, during the talk, there were no questions so far.
Okay.
Probably everything was very clear, Juan.
Thanks. I was a bit fast, but I knew there was a lot to pack into a short talk.
Perhaps you can elaborate a little bit about on your plans. Do you want to develop this further in a certain direction?
Well, I'd say most of the energy I've put this year was having the CakePHP fixtures go kind of official. So now that they are in the official documentation, it's a release. I know that people are using it, so that the method was a good idea. It just validates our IP. The effort I'll put now is more, on that test database cleaner. And I'm going to develop it, yes. But for this, I need help of the community, because I know CakePHP, I know Laravel quite well, Symfony, I'm into it a bit, but we need help from all other frameworks to give their contribution, let's say, and develop that approach.
Yeah, so let's take this as the end of the session. Feel free to join the project, to help out, to bring in ideas. And
Thanks.
thank you very much again, Juan. What we can provide is a big applause here, virtual applause here in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're gonna have now a lunch break. We'll be back with the keynote and sessions at 1:45. So stay tuned.
Bye-bye.
Bye.